Welcome back to the third part of our series on the 60 worst kings in history. In the last two episodes, we explored rulers whose greed, bad decisions, and careless actions brought disaster to their people and kingdoms. Today, we continue the journey with 20 more kings whose reigns left behind destruction, conflict, and lasting scars. Some were reckless warriors chasing glory. Others were weak and indecisive, but all of them share one thing in common. Their rule turned out to be a burden for their people. Stay with us as we uncover more stories of kings who should never have worn the crown.
41. Focus of Byzantium, 602 to 610. The reign of Phocas is often remembered as one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Eastern Roman Empire. He rose to power not through legitimacy or merit, but through bloodshed, when he led a rebellion against Emperor Maurice and had him and his family slaughtered. This act alone stained his rule from the very beginning, as it was not just political upheaval, but an act of cruelty that shocked the empire. Phocas quickly proved unfit to guide a state that needed strong direction. Instead of bringing stability, his years in power were filled with corruption, brutality, and disastrous decisions that left the empire weak and vulnerable. He had little interest in improving the government or addressing the needs of the people. His attention was fixed on eliminating rivals, punishing critics, and enriching himself and his allies. One of his worst legacies was the empire's decline in the face of foreign threats. The Persians, enraged by the murder of Maurice, who had once been their ally, launched devastating invasions during Phocas's rule. Cities were burned, land was lost, and the empire's defenses collapsed. Instead of rallying his forces, Phocas spent his energy punishing officers he didn't trust, which destroyed morale in the army. Soldiers deserted, generals turned against him, and the borders fell into chaos. Life in the capital was equally grim. Phocas became notorious for cruelty. Executions were public and excessive, often targeting innocent people accused of plotting against him. Fear ruled Constantinople, with citizens whispering in private and dreading the attention of imperial spies. His inability to inspire loyalty led to constant unrest. By the time Heraclius, a governor's son, rose in rebellion, Phocas was so hated that many welcomed the change. When Heraclius entered Constantinople in 610, Phocas was captured. Accounts say that when he was brought before Heraclius and asked what kind of rule he had given the empire, Phocas snarled defiantly. That arrogance was his last act before being brutally executed. Phocas is remembered not for achievements, but for presiding over years of decline and cruelty. He rose through violence, governed through fear, and left behind only destruction. His reign weakened the empire so badly that it struggled for decades to recover, making him one of the worst rulers of the Byzantine world.
42. Louis II of Hungary, 1516 to 1526. Louis II became king of Hungary and Bohemia as a child, but by the time he reached adulthood, the realms he ruled were in desperate need of strong leadership. Instead, his short reign ended in disaster, with his kingdom torn apart and much of Hungary falling under Ottoman control. Louis was more interested in personal pleasures than in the responsibilities of rule. He spent lavishly on luxuries while neglecting the urgent need to strengthen defenses against the growing power of the Ottoman Empire. The treasury emptied as the nobility enriched themselves, and no serious attempt was made to reform the army or prepare the population for the danger on the horizon. When Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent advanced into Hungary in 1526, Louis was completely unprepared. Instead of carefully planning his defense, he rushed headlong into battle at Mohas with a poorly organized and badly equipped force. The decision was reckless. His army, though brave, was no match for the disciplined and well-supplied Ottoman troops. The battle turned into a massacre. Thousands of Hungarian soldiers were cut down, and the kingdom's leadership was shattered in one afternoon. Louis himself attempted to flee the battlefield, but drowned in a marsh when his horse stumbled. His death at only 20 years old symbolized the tragic end of an era. The consequences were catastrophic. Hungary was divided, with large portions falling under Ottoman control and others absorbed by the Habsburgs. The proud kingdom that had once stood as a bulwark of Christendom against Turkish expansion was reduced to a shadow of itself. Louis II's failures were not just military. His neglect of administration, his inability to restrain the nobility, and his lack of foresight left his kingdom vulnerable. Historians often call the Battle of Mohas the grave of Hungary, and Louis is remembered as the careless young king whose poor choices and lack of preparation brought ruin to his people. 43. Nero, 54 to 68 CE. Few rulers in history are as infamous as Nero, whose name has become a symbol of cruelty, excess, and neglect. Rising to power as a young man, Nero might have been shaped into a capable leader under the guidance of his early tutors, but instead he chose a path of indulgence and brutality. Nero's reign began with promise, but he quickly abandoned state affairs for personal pleasures. He fancied himself a musician and performer, spending vast sums on theatrical shows and forcing Rome's elite to attend his performances. He treated the empire as his stage, and the people were made unwilling spectators. His cruelty was unmatched. Nero ordered the murder of his own mother, Agrippina, who had helped secure his throne. He later killed his wife Octavia in cold blood. Friends and advisors who questioned him were executed or driven to suicide. Fear gripped the Senate, which became little more than a tool for his whims. The most infamous event of his reign was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. While historians debate whether Nero started the blaze, what is clear is his shameless behavior afterward. Instead of taking responsibility or helping the victims, he blamed the Christians, then a small and unpopular sect, and ordered horrific persecutions. Many were burned alive or torn apart by wild beasts, all to deflect attention from his failures. Nero's obsession with luxury drained the treasury. Heavy taxes and confiscations angered both rich and poor. Rebellions broke out in the provinces, including Gaul and Judea. Even his own army eventually turned against him. Declared an enemy of the state, Nero fled Rome. Abandoned by nearly everyone, he committed suicide in 68 CE, reportedly exclaiming, "What an artist dies in me." 44. Stephen of England, 1135 to 1154. Stephen of England's rule is best known for plunging the kingdom into one of the most chaotic and violent periods of the Middle Ages. His claim to the throne in 1135 sparked a civil war that lasted nearly 2 decades, remembered as the Anarchy. Stephen seized power after the death of King Henry I, despite Henry having named his daughter Matilda as heir. This act of usurpation set the stage for conflict. Many nobles supported Matilda's claim, while others backed Stephen, and the result was years of war that devastated England. Stephen was brave in battle, but lacked the political skill needed to hold the crown securely. He granted excessive favors to the barons in order to keep their loyalty, which weakened central authority. Castles sprung up across the land, often in the hands of lords who used them to terrorize the countryside. Chroniclers wrote of villages burned, crops stolen, and people left in misery as rival armies marched back and forth. The kingdom became a patchwork of shifting alliances. At times, Matilda gained the upper hand, even capturing Stephen in 1141, only to lose support due to her arrogance. Stephen eventually regained the throne, but the conflict dragged on with no clear resolution. By the end of his life, Stephen was forced to compromise. In 1153, he agreed that Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, would inherit the throne. When Stephen died the next year, Henry became King Henry II, restoring order after nearly 20 years of chaos. Stephen is remembered not for cruelty or extravagance, but for weakness. His inability to secure loyalty, his poor decisions in rewarding barons, and his failure to bring peace left England in ruins. The anarchy scarred the nation, and Stephen's reign became a cautionary tale of how poor leadership can plunge a kingdom into disaster. 45. Caligula, 37 to 41 CE. Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, is one of the most notorious rulers in Roman history. His reign began with high hopes, but quickly descended into madness, cruelty, and excess. In just 4 years, he managed to leave a reputation so dark that his name still evokes images of tyranny. At first, Caligula was welcomed as a breath of fresh air after the grim rule of Tiberius. Crowds cheered him, and for a brief period he acted with generosity. But soon his behavior changed dramatically. Ancient sources describe him as falling into delusion, convinced of his own divinity and obsessed with humiliating the Senate and nobility. Caligula indulged in shocking extravagances. He built lavish palaces, staged costly games, and demanded adoration as a living god. He is said to have dressed as gods and goddesses, and even ordered temples to be built in his honor. To fund his excess, he imposed crushing taxes and confiscated the fortunes of wealthy citizens, leaving resentment across the empire. His cruelty was just as infamous. Executions were ordered on a whim. He mocked victims as they died and took pleasure in causing suffering. Stories circulated of him forcing parents to watch their children executed or humiliating senators in public. Perhaps the most bizarre tale is his reported plan to make his favorite horse, Incitatus, a consul. While some argue this was satire meant to insult the Senate, it revealed Caligula's contempt for Rome's institutions. Eventually, his own guards turned against him. In 41 CE, Caligula was assassinated in a palace conspiracy. The people did not mourn his passing. Rather, his death was seen as a relief. Caligula is remembered as a ruler who turned Rome into his playground, where cruelty and excess replaced order and stability. His short reign became a warning of what happens when absolute power falls into the hands of someone driven by vanity and delusion.
46. King Charles IX of France, 1560 to 1574. Charles IX came to power as a young man during one of the darkest times in French history, when Catholic and Protestant factions were fighting violently in the wars of religion. Instead of bringing peace, his reign is remembered for one of the bloodiest massacres in Europe. He had little ability to control events around him, and his court became a stage for manipulation and cruelty. The most infamous episode was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572. Charles IX, under the heavy influence of his mother, Catherine de' Medici, and hardline Catholic advisors, gave approval for a limited strike against Protestant leaders in Paris. What followed was a wave of killings that spiraled out of control. Thousands of French Protestants, known as Huguenots, were slaughtered not only in Paris, but in towns and villages across France. The bloodshed shocked Europe and deepened divisions that would last for decades. Instead of bringing peace, the massacre fueled civil war, ensuring more cycles of vengeance and distrust. Charles was known for violent outbursts and mood swings. Contemporary accounts describe him as unstable, sometimes haunted by nightmares and guilt. He would later break down, convinced he had blood on his hands. His paranoia grew as France became more fractured, and he seemed incapable of holding authority together. He alienated both Protestants and moderate Catholics, leaving only extremists satisfied. In addition to this tragedy, Charles neglected opportunities for reform. Taxation was harsh, corruption was widespread, and trade slowed because of constant unrest. He lacked vision for the country's future, and instead allowed his mother and advisors to rule in his place. His personal cruelty also emerged in sport. He was known to shoot animals in Paris streets for amusement, an act seen as symbolic of his disregard for suffering. Charles IX died young at 23.
his body weakened by tuberculosis, and his mind tormented by guilt. His reign left France in chaos, with entire communities destroyed and families torn apart. Instead of healing divisions, he deepened them. His memory remains tied forever to the massacre, making him one of the most tragic and destructive rulers in French history. 47. King James II of England, 1685 to 1688. James II's time on the throne was short, but left a long shadow. He came after his brother Charles II and immediately began pushing England toward policies that many of his subjects feared and resisted. His rule ended with the Glorious Revolution, when he was forced to flee, but not before his actions caused deep distrust and unrest. One of his most damaging traits was his push for absolute control. James ignored traditional agreements between ruler and parliament, believing his word should be final. Instead of working with political leaders, he bypassed them, issuing royal decrees and filling offices with men loyal only to him. This caused resentment among nobles and commoners alike, who saw their freedoms under threat. Another major issue was his open Catholic faith in a country that had been shaped strongly by Protestant traditions. He gave Catholics high positions in government and the army, even when they lacked experience. This fueled fears that England might return to religious oppression. His attempts to change laws protecting Protestant dominance in society angered many, leading to secret meetings among nobles who began plotting against him. His reliance on intimidation worsened matters. He kept a standing army close to London, alarming those who saw it as a weapon to silence opposition. He also ordered harsh punishments against those who opposed him, creating an atmosphere of fear rather than respect. His failure to build trust made his downfall almost inevitable. The breaking point came with the birth of his son in 1688. Until then, many believed his Protestant daughter Mary would inherit the throne. But with the new child, a future line of Catholic rulers seemed assured. This pushed nobles and military leaders to act, inviting William of Orange to intervene. When William landed with an army, James found himself abandoned by many of his own supporters. Instead of fighting, James fled the country, throwing the royal seal into the Thames as he left. His flight sealed his image as a failed ruler, unwilling to stand and defend his throne. His short reign is remembered not for achievements, but for alienating his people, threatening freedoms, and sparking a crisis that forced him into exile. 48. Emperor Heliogabalus of Rome, 218 to 222 CE. Elagabalus, who became emperor at just 14 years old, is remembered as one of the most bizarre rulers in Roman history. His reign was marked not by strong leadership or military success, but by scandal, extravagance, and strange religious practices that shocked his subjects. One of his most controversial actions was introducing the worship of the Eastern sun god Elagabal, after whom he took his imperial name. He tried to replace traditional Roman gods with this foreign deity, building a massive temple in Rome and forcing senators and generals to take part in ceremonies. This angered both the religious elite and common citizens, who saw it as disrespectful to Rome's traditions. Elagabalus's personal behavior scandalized Rome further. He staged lavish banquets where guests were buried in flower petals or left unable to escape from locked dining rooms. He dressed in unusual costumes, sometimes appearing as a woman, and offered himself in marriage multiple times in ways that shocked the conservative Roman Senate. His disregard for tradition made him appear reckless and unstable. He also ignored pressing matters of state. While borders were under threat, he preferred indulgence in luxury and theatrical displays. He appointed unqualified friends and lovers to high positions, weakening Rome's administration. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, had to intervene often just to keep the empire functioning. Elagabalus grew increasingly unpopular with the Roman military, whose loyalty was vital. His strange rituals, wasteful spending, and disregard for tradition turned soldiers against him. By 222, his own guards turned on him. He was assassinated at just 18 years old, his body dragged through the streets before being thrown into the Tiber River. His reign left a reputation of chaos and disgrace. Instead of building Rome's strength, Elagabalus became a symbol of decadence and youthful folly, remembered more for excess and scandal than leadership.
49. King Otto IV of the Holy Roman Empire, 1209–1218. Otto IV rose to power during a time of fierce struggles for control in Central Europe, but his rule is remembered as a tale of betrayal, failed ambition, and destructive choices. He was initially supported by the Pope in his bid to claim the imperial crown, but once in power, Otto quickly broke promises and made reckless decisions that left his realm weakened. At first, he swore to defend the Church's rights and honor agreements with the Pope. However, once he secured power, he turned against the very institution that had helped him. He seized lands belonging to the Church, angering the Pope and creating a lasting feud. This betrayal destroyed trust and cost him vital allies. Otto also launched an ambitious campaign to control southern Italy, directly challenging papal authority. This reckless adventure stretched his resources and brought little reward. His army suffered defeats, and his rivals grew stronger. The Pope excommunicated him, stripping him of legitimacy and encouraging other nobles to abandon him. His broken promises and rash wars gave rise to Frederick II, a more capable rival who gained wide support. As Frederick's strength grew, Otto's influence collapsed. He lost allies among the German princes, who saw him as untrustworthy. Even his former backers in England, tied to him by family, eventually withdrew support. By the end of his reign, Otto was largely powerless, confined to a small portion of territory, while Frederick rose as the new ruler. He died in relative obscurity, remembered not as a great emperor, but as one who squandered trust, betrayed allies, and pursued reckless wars that left his legacy in ruins. 50. King Michael of Romania, 1927–1930 and 1940–1947. Michael ruled Romania during two separate periods, both overshadowed by outside forces and national crises. His reign is often seen as one of weakness, not because of personal cruelty, but because of his inability to prevent Romania from falling under dictatorship and later Soviet domination. In his first reign, Michael was only a child, with real power held by regents. This left the country adrift, and when his father, Carol II, returned to seize the throne, Michael was brushed aside. His second reign came during World War II, when Romania was under the strong influence of authoritarian leaders and Nazi Germany. Michael found himself surrounded by powerful generals and politicians who left him little room to act. One of his boldest moments was in 1944, when he staged a coup against the pro-German government and aligned Romania with the Allies. This act shortened the war in Eastern Europe and showed courage. However, the country soon fell under Soviet occupation, and Michael had no power to resist. The Communists forced him to abdicate in 1947, ending his reign. While Michael is often remembered sympathetically, critics argue that he lacked the strength to defend Romania's independence. He signed decrees under pressure and allowed others to make decisions that shaped the country's fate. His inability to resist outside domination left Romania vulnerable to decades of communist rule. Though not personally cruel, his time on the throne symbolizes a failure to defend the nation at a critical moment. 51. King Ferdinand of Bulgaria, 1887–1918. Ferdinand of Bulgaria is often remembered as a man of charm, refinement, and ambition, but behind those qualities lay decisions that dragged his country into disaster. His reign spanned decades, yet his most defining choices involved wars that left Bulgaria broken, humiliated, and weakened. His hunger for power and misjudgment of alliances destroyed much of what Bulgaria had achieved in the late 19th century. Ferdinand rose to power in 1887, during a period of instability. Bulgaria had recently freed itself from Ottoman rule, and national pride was high. Instead of consolidating peace, Ferdinand was obsessed with expanding Bulgaria's borders to match the dream of a greater Bulgaria. This vision, while appealing to some, led him to gamble recklessly with the lives of his people. The First Balkan War of 1912 initially gave him glory. Bulgaria joined an alliance with Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro to push the Ottomans further out of Europe. Victories came quickly, and Bulgarian forces played a major role. But Ferdinand could not resist pushing for more. He demanded territories promised to allies and grew greedy, believing Bulgaria alone deserved the lion's share of victories. This arrogance led directly to the Second Balkan War in 1913, when Bulgaria turned on its former allies, Serbia and Greece. The result was disastrous. Instead of gaining more land, Bulgaria was crushed and forced to surrender territory. The dream of a greater Bulgaria collapsed, leaving bitterness and resentment at home. Ferdinand's most destructive decision came during World War I. Hoping to regain lost lands, he sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary, ignoring warnings that this choice could bring ruin. At first, Bulgaria gained some ground, but as the war dragged on, the nation faced hunger, suffering, and heavy losses. When Germany collapsed, Bulgaria was forced to surrender, and the harsh peace treaty that followed stripped more land and resources away. His people turned against him. Once admired for his cultured manners and grand ambitions, he became a symbol of reckless pride. In 1918, after Bulgaria's defeat, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his son. He lived the rest of his life in exile, surrounded by luxury but haunted by failure. His reign left Bulgaria smaller, weaker, and deeply wounded, a tragic reminder of how one man's hunger for expansion can destroy a nation's future. 52. King Charles VII of Sweden, also known as Charles Knutson, 1448 to 1470. King Charles VII of Sweden, also known as Charles Knutson, is remembered for a reign filled with constant strife, rebellions, and failures to unite his kingdom. Instead of strengthening Sweden during a time when Scandinavian nations were struggling for dominance, his rule left the country unstable and plagued by conflict. He first came to power in 1448, chosen by nobles after the death of Christopher of Bavaria. Charles claimed the throne not only of Sweden, but also sought crowns in Denmark and Norway, sparking rivalry with other claimants. Instead of bringing unity, his ambition set the stage for decades of fighting in Scandinavia. The Kalmar Union, which had once promised cooperation between the three kingdoms, was torn apart by his actions. Charles faced rebellion from the start. Many nobles disliked his policies and alliances. Farmers rose in protest against heavy taxes, while rival factions invited foreign powers to intervene. His inability to create loyalty among his own people meant he spent much of his reign battling uprisings. His harsh treatment of enemies only deepened resentment. In fact, he was forced off the throne not once but twice, exiled as rivals replaced him. Each time he returned, it was not through skillful diplomacy or popular support, but because of shifting alliances among nobles. Economically, Sweden suffered under his rule. Wars drained resources, trade slowed, and ordinary people bore the burden of taxes. Instead of reforming systems or improving conditions, Charles focused on securing his position and fighting opponents. This short-sightedness meant Sweden fell further behind as other European nations grew stronger. By the end of his reign in 1470, Charles had lost the chance to make Sweden stable or prosperous. He died while still embroiled in conflicts, leaving his successors to face the same divisions. His time on the throne is remembered less for achievements and more for constant struggles and failures to unite his land. For a king who ruled more than 20 years, Charles left surprisingly little to celebrate, and his legacy is one of turmoil rather than progress.
53. King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, 1900 to 1946. Victor Emmanuel III sat on the throne of Italy during one of the most dangerous periods of the country's history.
While his reign lasted nearly half a century, he is remembered not for great leadership, but for allowing fascism to rise unchecked, enabling Benito Mussolini's dictatorship and leading Italy into disaster during World War II. At the beginning of his reign, Victor Emmanuel seemed modest and reserved. However, when Italy faced crisis in 1922, as Mussolini's fascist movement gained momentum, the king made a fateful decision. Instead of defending Italy's fragile democracy, he allowed Mussolini to seize power during the March on Rome. He could have ordered the army to stop Mussolini's black shirt forces, but instead, he handed Mussolini the prime minister's position. This single choice gave fascism legitimacy and doomed Italy to decades of oppression. For the next 20 years, Victor Emmanuel remained on the throne while Mussolini dismantled freedoms, persecuted opponents, and dragged Italy into aggressive wars. The king rarely intervened, preferring to stay silent rather than risk losing his crown. He signed laws that stripped Jews of rights, gave Mussolini sweeping powers, and tied Italy to Hitler's Germany. By failing to act, he became a willing partner in tyranny. World War II exposed Italy's weakness. Italian soldiers were sent to hopeless battles in Greece, North Africa, and Russia. The nation suffered bombings, starvation, and occupation. When Mussolini fell in 1943, Victor Emmanuel tried to save his image by dismissing him, but it was far too late. Italians saw him as complicit in their suffering, and Allied leaders distrusted him. After the war, pressure grew for him to abdicate. In 1946, a referendum abolished the throne altogether, and Victor Emmanuel went into exile. He died in Egypt, far from the country he had once ruled. His legacy is one of cowardice and failure, remembered as the king who handed power to Mussolini and failed to protect his people from dictatorship and war.
54. King Philip III of Spain, 1598 to 1621. Philip III of Spain inherited one of the richest empires in the world, stretching across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. Yet his reign is often seen as the beginning of Spain's long decline. While his father, Philip II, had been strict and hard-working, Philip III preferred comfort and pleasure, leaving real power in the hands of his favorites. This neglect led to corruption, waste, and decline. The most notorious figure of his reign was his advisor, the Duke of Lerma. Philip trusted him completely, allowing Lerma to control government decisions. Under Lerma, offices were sold for money, taxes were raised unfairly, and corruption flourished. Instead of addressing problems, Philip withdrew into hunting, festivals, and prayer, ignoring the suffering of his people. Philip also presided over one of the most destructive acts in Spanish history, the expulsion of the Moriscos, descendants of Muslims who had converted to Christianity. Over 300,000 people were forced to leave, many of them skilled farmers and artisans. This crippled parts of Spain's economy, leading to depopulation and decline in agriculture. The decision was motivated by religious zeal and fear, but it left Spain poorer and weaker. Meanwhile, Spain's costly wars drained treasure. Silver from the Americas could not keep up with endless spending. Philip's government declared bankruptcy more than once, and Spanish prestige abroad began to wane. Instead of reforming, Philip seemed content to let things slide. By the time he died in 1621, Spain was still powerful, but clearly on the path to decline. His son, Philip IV, would inherit an empire already weakened by waste and mismanagement. Philip III is remembered as a ruler who wasted opportunities, allowing corruption and poor decisions to damage the empire. His love of comfort over responsibility turned a strong kingdom into one burdened by decay. 55. King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia,
1378 to 1419. Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia is remembered as a weak and troubled ruler whose failures contributed to religious conflict and unrest in Central Europe. Though he inherited titles as King of Bohemia and King of the Romans, he lacked the energy, focus, and vision needed to manage his realms, leading to instability that erupted after his death. From the start, Wenceslaus showed little interest in governing. He spent much of his time hunting, drinking, and indulging in leisure rather than handling state affairs. Important matters were delayed or ignored, frustrating nobles and clergy alike. His neglect of duties created a power vacuum where others vied for control, weakening authority. His handling of religion was particularly damaging. During his reign, reformist preachers such as Jan Hus gained followers, calling for changes in the church. Instead of dealing wisely with the movement, Wenceslaus alternated between tolerance and repression. This inconsistency alienated both reformers and traditionalists. After Hus was executed, unrest exploded, leading to the Hussite Wars shortly after Wenceslaus's death. Politically, Wenceslaus faced revolts from nobles who resented his favoritism and careless governance. He was even captured by rebels at one point, an event that humiliated him and showed how little respect he commanded. His inability to control events meant his kingdom became divided and unstable, setting the stage for decades of violence. By the time of his death in 1419, Bohemia was on the brink of religious war, and the authority of the crown was in tatters. Instead of leaving a legacy of strength, Wenceslaus left chaos. He's remembered as a ruler who wasted opportunities, allowing divisions to grow until they erupted in bloodshed. His failures remind us how neglect can be just as destructive as cruelty in shaping history.
56. King Richard I of England, the Lionheart, 1189 to 1199. Richard I, famously called the Lionheart, is often celebrated as a great warrior and crusader. But when we look closely at his reign, we see a ruler who neglected his own country, drained its resources, and left England worse off. His story shows how glory abroad can mean disaster at home. From the very start, Richard showed little interest in England itself. He spent barely 6 months of his 10-year reign in the kingdom, treating it more as a source of income than as a land to govern. His heart was set on the Crusades, and for that purpose he taxed his people heavily, selling offices, lands, and privileges just to raise money. Entire towns were stripped of wealth to fund his wars in the Holy Land. His attitude was so careless that he once joked he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. The Crusades brought him fame as a soldier, but little benefit to his subjects. Richard fought bravely at Acre and clashed with Saladin, but ultimately failed to retake Jerusalem. Instead, he agreed to a truce that allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage, but left the holy city in Muslim hands. While this satisfied his pride as a negotiator, it did nothing to justify the enormous sacrifice of treasure and lives from England. On his way home, Richard was captured in Austria and held for ransom. To secure his release, his subjects were forced to pay an enormous sum, £65,000 of silver, an amount that devastated England's economy. Taxes rose again, peasants struggled, and resentment grew. Richard treated this ransom as his due, showing little concern for the suffering it caused. Meanwhile, at home, governance was left in the hands of officials who often abused their power. Corruption grew, law enforcement weakened, and disputes with France over land dragged England into further conflict. Richard's wars with King Philip II drained even more resources, forcing England into debt. Richard died in 1199 from a crossbow wound while besieging a small French castle. His death symbolized his reign, chasing minor conquests abroad while neglecting the kingdom that funded his adventures. Though celebrated as a warrior, he left England poorer, burdened with debt, and politically unstable. His fame as Lionheart hides the truth. He was a reckless ruler whose pride and obsession with war came at the cost of his people's well-being. 57. King Henry VI of England, 1422 to 1461 and 1470 to 1471. Henry VI's reign is one of the saddest and most destructive in English history. Coming to the throne as a child, he grew into a man unfit for leadership. His weak personality, bouts of mental breakdown, and inability to make firm decisions plunged England into the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil conflict that tore the country apart. Henry was gentle and pious, but these qualities did not serve him as king. He was indecisive, easily swayed by advisors, and unable to enforce authority. As France pressed against English holdings during the 100 Years' War, Henry failed to provide clear direction. Battles were lost and vast territories in France that his father, Henry V, had won, slipped away. Instead of rallying his lords, Henry retreated into prayer and left military matters to others. His marriage to Margaret of Anjou was meant to strengthen ties with France, but it caused resentment at home, especially because Margaret was strong-willed and often acted in Henry's place. Many nobles felt sidelined and factions formed around rival claimants to power. Henry's passivity allowed these rivalries to grow unchecked, eventually exploding into open conflict. Henry also suffered from mental illness, including long periods where he could not speak or make decisions. During one breakdown, he didn't even recognize his own son. These episodes left the kingdom effectively leaderless, with nobles seizing opportunities to advance their own claims. England descended into chaos, lawlessness spread, and ordinary people bore the brunt of constant warfare. The Wars of the Roses, fought between the houses of Lancaster, Henry's line, and York, were a direct result of Henry's inability to govern. Thousands died, villages were destroyed, and trust in the crown collapsed. Henry was captured, restored briefly, and then deposed again. His final years were spent as a prisoner in the Tower of London, where he was murdered in 1741. Henry VI left behind a broken country, scarred by war, instability, and distrust of weak rulers. His reign shows how indecision and lack of strength can be as destructive as cruelty, turning England into a battlefield for decades. 58. King Charles VIII of France, 1483 to 1498. Charles VIII came to power at a young age and quickly revealed himself to be rash and short-sighted. His reign is most remembered for the disastrous Italian campaigns that drained France's treasury, weakened its influence, and achieved almost nothing of lasting value. Dreaming of glory, Charles claimed the throne of Naples in southern Italy and launched a massive invasion in 1994. At first, success came easily. His army, equipped with modern artillery, marched through Italy, seizing cities with little resistance. But Charles failed to secure alliances or plan for long-term control. His rapid conquest alarmed other European powers, who quickly united against him. When the League of Venice formed, made up of Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy, and several Italian states, Charles found himself surrounded by enemies. His forces were driven back, and though he briefly held Naples, it was soon lost. The campaign wasted enormous sums of money and cost thousands of lives, leaving France in debt without real gains. Back in France, Charles's neglect of governance caused further problems. He focused almost entirely on his Italian dream while ignoring domestic reforms. His subjects bore the burden of heavy taxation, while nobles grew restless. His failure to manage resources responsibly meant France entered the next century weakened, setting the stage for later struggles under his successors. Charles's life ended suddenly in 1498 when he struck his head on a door frame and died. His reign, though short, left a mark of recklessness. He gambled friends' wealth and power on adventures that brought only humiliation. Instead of strengthening France, he left it poorer, politically isolated, and mocked by its rivals. 59. King Ladislaus V of Hungary, 1440 to 1457. King Ladislaus V, also called the Posthumous,
came to the throne as a child and spent much of his life under the control of regents. His reign is remembered for weakness, manipulation by powerful nobles, and the failure to provide leadership during a dangerous time for Hungary. Because he was so young when crowned, others ruled in his name. Nobles exploited this situation, enriching themselves and weakening central authority. The country fell into factional disputes, with rival groups competing for power. Instead of uniting Hungary against external threats, Ladislaus' government became paralyzed by infighting. One of the most damaging episodes of his reign was the handling of the heroic general John Hunyadi. Hunyadi had been a national defender against the Ottomans, but after his death, Ladislaus had Hunyadi's son executed, fearing his growing influence. This act outraged much of the population, alienating supporters and destroying trust in the crown. Ladislaus himself showed little interest in leadership. He spent much of his life away from Hungary, living in Vienna and Prague while the kingdom suffered from raids and internal unrest. His absence made him appear detached and uncaring, fueling further discontent. He died suddenly at only 17, possibly from illness, though rumors of poisoning circulated. His short reign left Hungary weakened and vulnerable to Ottoman advances. Instead of uniting the nation, it left it divided, with nobles mistrusting the crown and people disillusioned by failed leadership. 60. King Edward II of England, 1307 to 1327. Edward II is remembered as one of England's worst rulers, a man whose favoritism, poor judgment, and military failures led to rebellion, humiliation, and eventually his violent downfall. His reign shows how personal weaknesses can destroy a kingdom. Edward openly favored a series of companions, most notably Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, showering them with titles and wealth while sidelining other nobles. This favoritism enraged the barons, who saw their traditional rights ignored. The court became divided, and plots against the king multiplied. Instead of balancing his friendships with his duties, Edward deepened divisions that destabilized his realm. His greatest military disaster came at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1414, when his poorly led army was crushed by the Scots under Robert the Bruce. This defeat secured Scottish independence for years and humiliated England. Edward's failure on the battlefield destroyed his reputation as a capable leader. Internally, Edward mismanaged resources and allowed his favorites to exploit the people. Taxes were heavy, corruption widespread, and famine added to the misery of the population. His reliance on the Despenser family in particular provoked widespread rebellion, as they abused power and enriched themselves.
Even his marriage to Isabella of France turned against him. Neglected and resentful of his favorites, Isabella eventually allied with rebel nobles. In 1326, she and her partner Roger Mortimer invaded England, gathering support from those fed up with Edward's failures. The king was captured, forced to abdicate in favor of his son, and imprisoned. In 1327, Edward II died in custody under mysterious circumstances, likely murdered. His fall from power was as violent as his rule had been disastrous. Remembered for favoritism, defeat, and neglect, Edward left a legacy of humiliation. His reign remains a cautionary tale of how personal weakness and poor judgment can tear a kingdom apart.